if you don't want your face recorded, go ahead and turn your camera off. This will be eventually probably uploaded to the Applied Ballistics YouTube page so that we can help all shooters. We are going to go for about 45 minutes to an hour today. If you have questions, please add them to the chat, and then Emil will get to those as we go along. So without further ado, Emil, thank you so much for joining us today.
Hi, Amanda. Thank you. Can everybody hear me?
Yep.
Okay, great. Yeah, good morning, guys. So just make sure you are on mute, you know, so everybody can hear. And like Amanda said, if you have a question, throw it into the chat. So there's a couple of ways that my name's Emil Praslick. So we're going to talk a little bit about the wind and in shooting the wind and kind of how we deal with it. And there's a million different perspectives on this. Actually, I see some familiar names in this chat, and some of whom I think are quite good wind readers in their own right. But you know, wind is kind of a, as Brian Litz describes it, it's a non-deterministic variable. And I didn't know what that meant the first time Brian said it, because I'm not as smart as him. So I had to go look it up. And in like engineering world, it means that it cannot be expected to occur with certitude, which means that we don't know what's going to happen with the wind, which also means that like it's always different. It always changes. So that's really the most analog part of shooting that we have. You know, we can get good solutions on our kestrels. We can load to a kernel of powder. We can do all this stuff, man. But at the end of the day, the wind can change the last minute and ruin everything. So when I talk about reading the wind, quote, reading the wind or managing the wind, I usually go through a process with people. I say, hey, I do these things sort of in an order. And I try to pull this information from it. So I'm gonna start there with just a basic outline of my process. But I don't really want to turn this into like, you know, a quick PowerPoint class or anything like that. I want to leave time for people's questions and things like that. And so I will share my screen, but first I'll tell like a little war story. You know, when I was first started shooting competitively, I was on the U.S. Army team, the U.S. Army shooting team, and we were at this range out in 29 Palms, Marine Corps Base, 29 Palms, California, and we were shooting this match, 1,000-yard match out there, and the wind was just hooking. I mean, it was probably 15 to 25 mile an hour, super gusty. I'm at 1,000 yards with this old M14, and I'm like, holy crap, man, what do I do? And so I asked one of these old timers, to me at the time, an old timer on the Army team, is probably like 35 years old. I'm like, hey, Sergeant, how much wind is out there? And he looks down there and he looks through his spot and scope. He's like, man, that's about 13 minutes of wind. And I'm like, well, okay. So how, why is it that? And he goes, well, it just is. I'm like, well, what do you mean? What are you basing that on? And he's like, God damn it, it's 13 minutes of wind. Just put that on your rifle and shoot it. So he's like, it just looks like it is. When that flag is doing this thing and the Mirage is like that, you know, and this, that, and everything, that's 13 minutes. So I was like, well, I'm like, okay. He goes, man, you'll figure it out. He says, keep shooting and you'll figure it out by experience, basically is what he was telling me. And I asked him, how long will it take? And he goes, well, man, about 5-6 years, you'll start to get it. And I was like, what? Like, well, I don't have 5 or 6 years, man. Like 5-6 years, I might be fired from this team or I might be somewhere else. Like I want to know now. So I kind of started then trying to figure out like what was the basic process of how do I do it quickly. And then when I became coach of that team and I had to teach guys, And we had to shoot multiple different cartridges, you know, everything from 223, 300 Win Mag. And I was doing sniper training in the Army, and, you know, 338 Lapua and 50 cal and 308. And so like that thing that a lot of competition shooters do, where they know what the appearance of something looks like either a wind flag or what the Mirage looks like, or the tops of the trees moving. That thing of like corresponding what a picture in your brain looks like to what the condition is worth, that is extremely effective if you only shoot one type of platform, right? And there's lots of competition guys out there that are unbelievable wind readers, and that's their whole style. But for me, it never worked like that. I couldn't sort of correlate that as easy as some other people could. So I started doing it just a basic, almost like a mathematical approach to it. So I'm going to try to share my screen here. And I want to show just a couple of slides just to kind of get where I'm at here. And so can everybody see my screen here? They can still see that? Okay. I can't make this like the PowerPoint, hey, show the slide presentation thing. For whatever reason, that doesn't work on Zoom for me. So hopefully everybody can see this thing right here. So think about all this stuff first. Before we start talking about the wind, you have to have all these things: this rifle ammunition precision, stability of platform, accuracy over 0, data accuracy, and marksmanship. You know, read the stuff that Brian talks about in zeroing at 100 and why you do that, and getting a good zero for basically your point of impact and your point of aim being aligned. And stability of platform. You know, you have to have a stable position, whether it is off of a barrier, off a rooftop in PRS, or off of the bench, or off in the prone with the bipod, whatever it is. You have to know where the bullet is going to go, where at least relative to where you're pointing it initially. If you're not doing all this stuff that you see here, like the short answer is, if you suck, reading the wind isn't going to help you. Okay, so you need to make sure that, and I don't really even say that flippantly, like calling your shot. If I'm shooting with a partner, and he's spotting for me, and he tells me to break it on the right side of the target, and I break it on the left side of the target, and we hit in the center, he doesn't know what the wind is blowing anymore, right? I may not even know. All I know is I broke it left side of the target. If I tell him that, he can make an adjustment, right? Your brain works the same way. When I shoot, I treat my brain as the spotter. Like I'm always having a conversation with myself when I'm shooting. Like, okay, I broke it there, it hit there. That means that this is that. That means if I favored over here, I have to favor more, I have to favor less. Like that constant feedback loop. That's a really important part of what we're doing here. Whether you're spotting for somebody shooting, or you're shooting and spotting for yourself, which is a lot of times what we have to do. So you have to have all those things. Let's see, let me go down to really this kind of right here. This is where I usually start. So speed of the wind, direction of the wind, size of the target, wind's effect on the target. The first thing that I think about when I get out of the car or I step foot on a range is I'm assessing the speed of the wind, because it's a physical thing. I can see it first. If I you know, or if I'm walking up to a stage, I'm looking at the grass, I'm looking at the trees, I'm looking for anything that's moving in the world. Because if it's moving out there and the wind is causing that movement, I know there's wind. And then if I really analyze that movement, maybe I can start pulling some other information off it. So speed of the wind, that's by either a device or observation or both, right? So we have a pretty good device to measure wind speed. It's Kestrel. You can use that. After the speed of the wind, and by observation, I should back up a little. There's usually a chart like this everywhere in the world that says, hey, here's your physical effects of the wind, right? So this chart, I believe I pulled right out of the data book the Applied Ballistics data book. And it's a really good chart. It says something like 0 to 3 miles per hour, the smoke hardly drifts. You get up to 13 to 18, sand and loose paper, small trees and branches move, yada, yada. Now, this chart is pretty good, but see, I added a statement there at the bottom that physical effects vary on local vegetation. So you have to make sure that you are in your chart, your observed effects jive with where you live. So if you live in the middle of the desert, you may not have some of this vegetation to move. Or if the local vegetation you have moves at a different mile per hour of wind, you should know that too. So this kind of chart is a good reference point, but you should really be developing your own set of information like this for where you live. And it's a constant, it's a lifetime skill. I get out of the car in the grocery store, or I'm walking from the grocery store through the parking lot back to my car. I'm looking all over the place. I do it. I don't realize I'm doing it, but I know that I'm doing it. I'm looking at the tops of trees. I'm looking at the Mirage I can see on tops of the cars in the parking lot and see if it's moving or not. I'm looking at flags, outside the post office or at the car dealership. Anytime I drive by something that's being blown in the wind, I'm trying to pull a number off it. So that's something that is one of those things that, my old Sarge would tell me, you need time to do it. This is actually one of those things. You need some time of practicing this to try to figure it out. But going back to our thing here. So direction of the wind. So the direction of the wind is key. The wind has its most effect when it's kind of coming exactly perpendicular to your bullet's line of travel. And it has the least effect when it's blowing directly at the bullet or directly from behind the bullet. So we need to assess that direction. And it's easy to use a clock direction to do this. So we assess it by the o'clock number. And I'll show you, I have a couple of slides just to kind of help us visualize what basically it turns into a percentage of the wind. Many of us have heard these terms: no value, half value, full value winds. I like to dig a little bit deeper into that for extreme long range shooting and for shooting where the target's small. And I actually do use some of like really rough approximations, like half value, instead of like it's 15 degrees or it's 45 degrees or 30 degrees. I may just use those broader terms if I have a short range engagement or if it's low wind speed. Size of the target. Size of the target is important because we have to kind of know what we can get away with. If I'm shooting at a target the size of a house, well, then I probably don't need to have to do the same level of wind reading and get a wind solution as if I'm shooting at like a 1 MOA little steel plate, at distance. So the size of the target is important. Knowing that going in to the engagement, and that lets you figure out what your tactics are and the wind's effect at the target. And this is really, really important. This is one of the things that I think helps maximize hit percentage, especially if you're shooting at multiple targets, say in a stage in a match. Your first target is, say, 600, 700 meters, and then you end up hitting that target. Knowing the wind's effect at that target will help you hit the next target, right? And it also does kind of go into my previous point of knowing what kind of tactics you can use while you're shooting. Again, if the wind effect at the target, if 1, 2, 3 mile per hour difference still stays inside the width of the target, then small wind changes mean that I don't really have to do a lot of wheeling and dealing while I'm shooting, right? So those are the basic things. So speed of the wind, again, Kestrel, looking downrange, looking at some of these physical effects. That's probably the important thing. And while we're talking about wind speed, this is something that we do see, like especially in ELR shooting. We see this what we call wind gradient effects, where as the bullet gets higher off the ground, the wind speed is at a higher level than it is at the ground. And this is kind of caused by is that better for you guys? This is kind of caused by this sort of ground clutter that we have here. So the more ground clutter that we have, the more the wind is slowed down by it. So you get a bigger difference, I guess, is the best way of putting it, at a height. So this thing, which I stole right off Wikipedia, it uses this 20-mile-per-hour thing as like the constant speed. So you see over open water and fields, it gets up to 20 miles per hour here at about 750 feet, because this speed is closer to the ground speed because the terrain at the ground isn't that obstructive. And as the terrain gets more obstructive, it takes higher in altitude for the wind to clear that stuff and pick up the speed. So what does this mean as shooters? Well, so here's some calculations I did. I wrote a little Excel thing to kind of calculate this stuff. And there's information on this. You guys can find it on just Google wind shearing and wind gradient, and you'll get to the same place I arrived at. All right, so this is like open terrain, rolling hills. This is kind of like a normal rifle range type of deal. And this is like a 308, the max ord of a 308, depending on the bullet, but it can be approximately about 6 meters. That means that the highest that bullet is above your line of sight, it's 6 meters over your barrel and your scope pointing at the target, right? So on a kind of a traditional rifle range, open terrain, rolling hills, our wind speed only increases about 4%. So if I measured it about 5 miles an hour down here at like 1 meter off the ground, by the time I get 6 meters off the ground, it's only about 5.2, 5.3 miles an hour. So do I have to think about anything different because the bullet's high in the air and what the wind is up there on a range like this? I would not. But here's a range, rough terrain, open forests. So it's roughness. So this is a roughness factor that is actually, there's a whole list of them. This is the math. Okay, so all these different types of terrain have a different roughness factor, different roughness class. And that roughness class is an exponent you throw into a formula. Enough about that. So you see the wind speed actually doubles in this example. So it doubles. If I measured it at 4, it doubles to 8 by the time I get that same 6 meters off the ground. And, as we shoot farther and farther and our maximum ordinate gets higher and higher, that effect really starts to increase. So here's a 300 Norma Magnum at 1,500 meters. And I teach this a lot with military dudes, so you'll see some military calibers here. So the bullet's 8 meters in the air, and you can see it only increases 8% over our traditional kind of normal rifle range here. Again, would Emil Praslick add a couple of miles per hour to his initial wind speed estimation? No, probably not. But here I might 132% increase when the difference is the higher it gets in this type of class of terrain, the higher the wind speed gets. And here's our ELR example. There's 375 enabler at 2,500 meters, and that bullet is 30 meters in the air. All right, so at 30 meters in the air, I started around 5, and I ended up around 5.6, so about 12% increase. Still nothing that's going to break the bank. But we've got a 290% increase, so from 5 up to about 20 miles per hour with the 30 meters of height. So this stuff is pretty important the farther away you get. And sometimes it affects the shooters. We don't have to have this type of range to get this increase in wind speed because of the extreme elevation. If I'm shooting in the mountains and I'm shooting off of a hilltop, and once my bullet clears the ground around where I'm shooting from and is out in the middle of a canyon, then I might be in a situation where my bullet, I've just artificially made that bullet like, hey, now you're 30 meters in the air. So all of a sudden your bullet gets slapped with some major wind once it starts going across a valley or a canyon or something like that. So how to quantify it and how to actually use it. that's a little bit harder to do, man, to tell you guys the truth. So, oh, get out of here for a second. Okay. So a lot of times it's by feel, it's by a feeling, or if you observe a shot and it's way downwind from where you think it is, it actually gives you an idea of like, okay, well, that's probably what happened there. So I do know that this is being worked at different levels. I know there's some work being done both on the civilian side. There was a dude on one of these Zooms, I think it was the Kestrel Zoom, a guy from Canada, super smart dude. And he contacted me after and he's like, hey, I made up my own like little data card. I shoot a lot of like 22 rimfire, extreme long range rimfire. And I figured out based on the height of my trajectory and the height of where my barrel was, I kind of figured out what the wind effect was. And I added that to my wind call. And, so those types of things, I would encourage you guys to go out there and like do some thinking about it. If this is the type of shooting that you end up seeing. But going into value, which is where I probably want to spend the most of my time here today, is, the wind's effect is really largely based on the value that you're shooting it at. And so it's a percentage. And when you see a lot of new shooters make this mistake. You see them on the range, you're like, okay, so that at 12 o'clock is my direction of fire, and 3 o'clock is the most wind, and the wind's coming from somewhere over here. Let's call that half value, right? So instead, if it's a 10-mile-an-hour wind, they just say it's worth 5 miles per hour because it's, quote, half value. So I'm going to look at my little data card, and half of 10 is this, and this is what I'm going to put on my rifle. And they end up being way downwind. And the reason for that is because wind angle, it's not linear, it's effect, right? So the wind angle is not linear. And that means that if a 90-degree wind is full effect, I'm going to put another slide up here for you guys. That one. Okay. All right. So if the wind's effect at 3 o'clock is 100%, a lot of people think that a 130 wind, which is halfway between 12 o'clock and 3 o'clock, is half value or 0.5. It isn't. Halfway between 12 o'clock and 3 o'clock is really a 71% wind. That's because, again, it's a wind cosine. Is the way that it's actually explained, but the way that I use it, if you look at the sine of the angle, so the sine, the trigonometric functions of sine, cosine, and tangent. So the sine, this is in 15-degree increments. Each half hour on the clock is 15 degrees. So 12 o'clock is 0, 12:30 is 15 degrees, you see down here. 1 o'clock is 30 degrees, 1:30 is 45, 2 o'clock is 60, 2:30 is 75, 3 o'clock is 90. So if I take my scientific calculator and I say, what is the sine of 15 degrees? It's going to come back with 25.25. So a 12:30 wind or 15-degree wind is worth 25%. And you can see it's the same around the clock. You see these numbers repeat themselves, right? Except here I forgot to put something. So these numbers kind of repeat themselves as they go around. So we're just talking 12 o'clock to 3 o'clock. We're also talking 3 o'clock to 6 o'clock and 6 o'clock to 9 o'clock, that wind angle, depending upon your line of fire, right? So that 30-degree wind, which a lot of people thought was a 45-degree wind, is half value because it's halfway between 12 and 3. Well, it's really 2 o'clock. A 1 o'clock wind is 50%. And a 130 wind is 71%, and a 2 o'clock wind is 87%. So you can see if you get even the wind wrong by half an hour on the clock. So between 1:30 and 2 o'clock, you just missed the wind by 16%. If you miss it by a whole hour on the clock, say between 1 o'clock and 2 o'clock, that's the one that's going to hurt you the most. You just missed it by 37%. You're probably going to miss if the target is at any distance away. Now I don't, and how I kind of like use this data is I'll estimate the wind speed, and then I will apply a percentage to it and get the true wind speed. That works really well. Here's a better way to visualize it for you guys. So here's our direction of fire. We have a constant 10-mile-an-hour wind, and we'll go around the clock. So a 15-degree wind, that's our 1230 wind. The actual net effect for us is 2.5 miles an hour because a 15-degree wind is 25%. Okay, and then the next angle, 30 degrees. So that is 0.5, it's 50% wind. So that really is only about a half mile per hour, that's our half effect, or 5 miles an hour. There's our 45-degree wind. So that takes a 10-mile-an-hour wind, turns it into 7.1. And here's our 2 o'clock wind. That's a 8.7 mile per hour wind effect. Here's our 230 wind. You see how close that is to 10 miles an hour? 75 degrees is 96%. And there's our 3 o'clock wind. And that's all of them together. So you can see as we get more and more angle, the wind effect becomes greater and greater and greater, right? So some of these numbers are hard to use in the real world. So these are the numbers that I use here. So here's 12, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock. And so at 12:30, 25% is the same. 1 o'clock wind, still 50%. My 1:30 wind, I rounded up to 75%. That's easier for me to calculate and make percentages of. And then 2 o'clock wind, I round that guy up to 90%. And then anything past 2 o'clock, I call it 100% wind. Because again, I'm off less than 10%. By the time I get to 2:30, it's already, what was it, like 96% wind? So you might as well call it full value. So if you're going to memorize any numbers, it's these numbers right here on the half hour. 25, 50, 75, 90 at 2 o'clock. Anything past 2 o'clock is 100%. And then you see over here, this chart here, this is like the old school chart. You know, here's full value. Here's a really broad area where we call half value. And then this is kind of no value. You can use all these numbers and these terms as long as we have short range, or as my wind is below about 3 miles an hour. You can use this stuff because, again, my velocity, if it's that little, those percentages of it shouldn't make me miss the target unless I'm in an extreme situation. And in short range, you know, most of the calibers that we shoot, you know, obviously besides like rimfire, less than 500 meters, you don't have to do a lot of wind reading. You have to really just figure out which way the wind is blowing. Now, you can use this data, like I said, in 2 different ways. You can apply it to the wind speed and then use that wind speed number, that mile per hour number, in your calculations. An example of that, if you're shooting with a reticle, a scope reticle that's got, say, the wind dots, like the tremor reticles. So tremor 3 or tremor 2 or tremor 179, whatever we're up to. So you take there's dots in those reticles that represent a certain wind speed that you've figured out. The Kestrel has a really good feature in it that Todd Hodnett, that's all Todd Hodnett's brainchild, the wind dots and figuring it out how to use that with a solver. So the Kestrel has a accuracy first sort of mode, and it'll tell you if you have dots in your scope based on your gun that you built in the Kestrel, what those dots are worth. So if you're using a scope like that, then finding out what the actual true mile per hour number is probably good for you, right? If you're a data guy, and here it is like in a more linear manner, so you guys can see it like in a table and kind of how it works. So 15 degrees, 30 degrees, and what the percentages are. And this is basically how you use it. There's just a little arithmetic here. So, you know, if it's 10 mile an hour wind and it's 30 degrees, 10 times 0.5 is my effective crosswind, which is 5 miles an hour. So this works really well if you're a mile per hour guy. If you need miles per hour, you can also apply the same procedure on value to your data. So this is a 338 Lapua Magnum with a 300 grain Skinar at 2,700 feet per second. So here's my range down here. And all the way in this last column, this is my full value data. So like, let's go to something out here where it looks easy. So at 1100 meters, a full value wind, full value 10-mile-an-hour wind is 2 mils with a 338 Lopco Magnum. Okay, it's 2 mils out there. So you can see at a 1 o'clock wind, it's only 1 mil, because a 1 o'clock wind is going to be it's going to be 50%, right? And so at 60% wind, which is like, I'm calling it 90 or so, that's 1.8 mils. So you can use a chart like this, a regular wind chart, and you can apply the percentage to that and get your data that way. An example of that is if you're using one of these sort of rule of thumb deals, like, hey, I know the wind at a certain range equals this many mils or minutes. You know, way back in the old days, there's really nothing new under the sun when it comes to wind reading. I was in South Africa shooting way back, I don't know, about 20 years ago. And there was this like 90-year-old dude in South Africa at this range down there at their national championships. And he told me, hey, you don't just think about this series of numbers. I think he said 2, 2, 4, 5, 7, 8, 10. I'm like, well, what does that mean? And he goes, well, 2, 4, 5, 7, 8, 10. That's your 308 155 grain bullet in a 10-mile-an-hour wind at 300 yards, 500 yards, 600 yards, 800 yards, 900 yards, and 1,000 yards. So it's 2, 4, 5, 7, 8, 10. So if I go, what's the third number? 2, 4, 5. And the third range that we shoot is 600 yards. That means a 10-mile-an-hour wind at 600 yards was 5 minutes. Right. And that those types of things are, and Todd Hodden has another formula that he uses, that he teaches. It's very, very effective, his short wind formula. So, basically you're taking a range and how much a certain wind speed is at that range, right? And that helps you memorize what the wind speed is, right? So you can use the percentage of the wind against the data in that type of format as well. That works extremely well. So let me get back here. Get out of that. Okay. So wind speed, wind direction are huge. They are huge. And those are skills that you guys can learn on your own. On appearance of objects, this is actually, I usually talk about this when I teach this class. Back when I was in the Army, I would sometimes, if I went on a new range, so like, we would shoot at like Camp Perry, Ohio, right? I remember one year they got these new flags. So in that style of shooting, they actually put flags on the range, and the flag blows the wind and you can see it. So wind angle, the angle of the flag gives you a mile per hour number sometimes, if you know what to look for. So they bought brand new flags. I'm like, oh man, this sucks. Like, I knew the old flags. The old flags, I knew that however fast the wind was blowing, how high the flag was, I could put a number on that. Like, I could read it, within a half mile an hour. So I took one of my young guys with a Kestrel and a radio, and I told him, hey, dude, run down there and stand by that wind flag. He's like, okay. I'm like, I got on radio. I'm like, okay, put your Kestrel over your head. And you put this Kestrel up as high over his head as he can reach. And I looked through my spot and scope at the flag, and I was thinking, okay, so that looks like 8 miles an hour. I'm like, hey, bro, what's the wind speed? And he looked at the Kestrel, was like, Sergeant, that's like 11 miles an hour. And I'm like, oh, shit, that's not 8, that's 11. I'm like, okay, let me calibrate my eye here. Okay, so that is 11. I'm like, all right, man, so go to that next flag. So you can actually do that around terrain. I mean, it's kind of if you have 2 cell phones and a buddy with a Kestrel, you guys can get apart from each other and try to guess the wind at each other's location. That's a really good training thing to do, because again, you are building those sort of skills of identifying the wind at the position. In terms of major stuff to talk about here, I do want to throw up this slide and let you guys look at this, because I'm talking here a lot about, okay, the wind within a half a mile an hour. And if somebody came up to me and said, Like I see Randy Weiss is here. Randy's a fantastic shooter. And so if Randy came up to me, he's like, Emil, what's a elite wind reader shooting? And I'd say, well, the ability to read the wind within about 2 miles per hour, velocity wise, and know the direction within half an hour on the clock or 15 degrees. If you could do those two things, you're going to hit almost every target. Almost every target you're going to hit. Some extreme long range matches that I've shot and I've seen, you know, the target might actually only be like less than a half a mile an hour of wind worth wide, right? Which means that, you know, if the wind 1 mile per hour of wind, say, blows my bullet, say at 0.2 mils at that extreme range, 1 mile an hour moves the bullet 0.2 mils, and my target is like 0.1 mils wide in my reticle, then that target's half a mile an hour of wind wide. And good luck. That's a really hard target to hit, right? So, but normally, if we're not dealing with that type of thing, you don't have to get that far down in the weeds, because a lot of times what we're doing in shooting is we want to engage the target quickly. Competition, tactical, hunting, you don't have all the time in the world to pull out your abacus, you know, and your slide rule and your calculator and punch in sine of angles and stuff like that. So take a look really quick at this. I need to share my screen first. Take a look at this slide really quick and just get an idea of what I'm talking about. All right, so this is kind of how I think about it, and again, in my brain, of what my tactics are. So here, this top one here, .308 Winchester, 175 Match King. This is like the boilerplate sort of ammunition, right? From 0 to 500 meters, high percentage of hit, just using the direction and the upwind edge hold in average conditions. So in 7 miles an hour of wind or less, on like an IPSC size target, I can hit every single target in the world if the wind is 7 miles an hour or less by just holding on the upwind edge. That's a hit, because it takes more than 7 miles an hour of wind to push my bullet all the way across the target and off the target. And you say the net with a .308, 500 to 1,000. Well, I'm going to have to hold within a half a wind dot, which is about within 2 miles an hour, and the upwind or downwind edge. Now, I'm going to get a lot of hits that way. But it isn't until I get to about 1,000 meters or plus where I have to get down into the weeds, less than 2 miles an hour wind, direction within 15 degrees to hit. And as you can see, as I get down here, my caliber ballistically gets better, these numbers change. So here, you know, with a 6.5 Creedmoor, I can get away out to 600 meters, or, you know, about 660 yards. Again, just using that same tactic, 7 miles an hour of wind or less, I can just hold on the upwind edge. Hold left edge, man. Like the most common wind call in the world, left edge. Send it. And it isn't until I get to about 1,100 meters that I really have to start slicing and dicing. And then with 300 Norma, you can see why the military chose the Norma with the Berger 215 as the sniping caliber. You know, out to 800 meters, you have the same capability as 500 meters with a .308. And you're just extending the range that you can get a higher hit percentage, right? So I don't recommend you do all these things that I'm talking about every single shot engagement. You should kind of know, a lot of race car drivers are also really good mechanics, because they kind of understand what's happening under the motor. They kind of know what's going on with the race car. You should be the same way as a shooter. The more you kind of know what's happening underneath the hood, with the wind and regular other stuff, ballistics and all that other things, it helps you become a better shooter. Just to illustrate this point really quick, this is like a pretty good visual. So my wind here is coming from the right. And I'm assuming I'm going to hold right here. I'm going to hold on the upwind edge. I'm going to hold right here on the target. So in a 0 mile per hour wind, that's where I hit. But it takes at 300 meters, it takes at 20 miles an hour by aiming up here, my bullet drifts over here, because 20 mile an hour of drift at 300 meters is 1.5 mils, which is about the width of an IPSC. So at 300 meters, do I have to read wind? No. This means that like at 20 mile, anything less than 20-mile-an-hour wind, I'm still going to hit the target just by aiming here. And as I go down in range, you can see these velocity numbers. You're basically seeing how wide the target is. See, at 500 meters, my target's 7 miles an hour wide. And at 600 meters, it's 4 miles an hour wide. So with a 308, once you get past 600, you got to start figuring it out. And I think I've got other cartridges here. Yeah, here's a 6.5 Creedmoor with a 140 Burger. And you can see how wide the target is. Those numbers are getting bigger. My target's becoming wider for me because my bullet has a higher BC, and velocity and everything else under the sun is making it more ballistically effective. Then if I go to something like, here's a 300 Norma, at 600 meters, it's still 9 miles an hour wide, right? And then all the way out to 900 meters, it's the same width as like almost a 600-yard target with a 308, right? So these are all step up. So again, knowing how wide the target is can help influence your tactics. Now let me look at some of these. Let me look at some of the questions here, because I want to get to these. Okay, so slide 14. Are you adding that? Or are you letting? Oh, that's probably referring to the wind speed and height. So am I adding it? So what I'll usually do is, if I'm using the Kestrel, I'll manually toggle the velocity number. So if I look at like the wind height kind of relationship thing, and I'm like, you know what, that wind is probably, it might be doubled up there. Now it's not double the whole length of my trajectory, or maybe it is if I'm shooting over a canyon. So in that case, yes, I'll manually, if I'm using the Kestrel as my data kind of generation tool, I'll just manually toggle that mile per hour number on my Kestrel. So it's a great question from Ryan Hay, who is the Kestrel guy, and my Magneto speed guy. Ryan's a great dude. So Kestrel, do you run direction of fire and wind direction in degrees or clock? So do I set my Kestrel up in clock or degrees? I use clock instead of degrees. Now, sometimes I might actually manually enter the degrees. So here's a good example. I was shooting a match out in Kansas at Spear Point, this extreme long range match. And we were trying to hit a freaking target like 4,000 yards away or something. It was ridiculous. And the targets were small, man. They were like less than 2 MOA size targets. I mean, this one, by the time we got out there, the targets were like 1 MOA size. And so so for me to find the direction of the wind, one technique I use is I actually take my spotting scope and I'll turn it. So if I'm looking downrange and I see a Mirage, left to right Mirage, I'll turn my spotting scope left to right until I see a boil in the Mirage. That tells me it's no value wind. So like I did all this stuff. I turned my scope and I found the boil, and then I took a compass, like my phone, iPhone has a compass in it. Lots of things have compasses nowadays. And my Garmin watch here has a compass. So I actually took my watch, I believe, and I went right behind the angle that my spotting scope was, looking into the boil, and I shot an azimuth. Right. And it was like 109 degrees magnetic or whatever it was. And I shot an azimuth at the target, and I figured out what the 2 different azimuths were. And I entered that degree number into my Kestrel. Like that's really here's a slide to kind of show you guys what I'm talking about. Like that is getting about the most fidelity you possibly can. So this right here, kind of what I did. So I actually shot an azimuth toward the target. I think this was a screenshot I did on my phone when I was down at Fort Bragg. And so basically, I think it was 60 degrees to the target and then 120 azimuth to the wind. And that was a 60-degree difference. So my wind angle was 60 degrees. So I know that that's like 87% or 90% if I'm using the kind of the rounded numbers, right? But you can actually enter that and type in the sine angle, figure out the difference in degrees, and put that in your Kestrel, or if you want to do it manually, enter that number into a calculator and pull the sign off of it, and you're going to get the exact wind percentage. I mean, if you want to be super nerd, that works, right? Okay, so does the Kestrel give you a full picture when comparing the same bullet at different velocities? For example, 200 feet per second difference in velocity for 105 hybrid and a 7 for accurate in the real world. Yeah, the Kestrel, if you're trying to use the Kestrel to war game different wind drift stuff, like, okay, let me compare these two different bullets. Let me enter that information into the Kestrel. Yeah, the Kestrel has a solver, has the applied ballistic solver. It's going to give you good data. Me personally, I use the Kestrel more as a data device than a target engagement device. You can use it as a target engagement device very well. I would send you over, because I don't want to turn this into a Kestrel class because I'll go like another hour and a half. But the Kestrel has a compass in it, and if that compass is calibrated, you can point that Kestrel at your target, set the direction of fire. You can then point that Kestrel into the direction the wind is blowing, measure the wind speed. The Kestrel knows which direction you're pointing it in, set that, and it gives you a firing solution, right? So if you have everything else built into that, right? So you've got you enter in your latitude of your, on the planet Earth where you're shooting. It knows the azimuth. The Kestrel is going to do Coriolis. It's going to do the wind percentage. It's going to do aerodynamic jump. It's going to put everything in there, and you can just shoot the number the Kestrel tells you what to do, right? That takes a little bit longer, and it's a little bit more difficult to apply if you're shooting multiple stages, like in a match. So you can use a Kestrel as an engagement tool. You can also use it as a data tool. I tend to use it more as a data tool. Shooting with high berms, like on a range, the big like mounds they have on either side of a range, a berm. And there's for first 50 meters means no aerodynamic jump. That's a really good question. I don't know. I believe that if the wind hits the bullet at any point the first time, it may cause aerodynamic jump. So even if you've got zero wind the first 20, 30 feet, you may see aerodynamic jump farther down range anyway. But that's a good question to ask Brian. Do you have a fast method to average multiple weighted conditions across the length of the range? This is a great question. So this is basically a question of what if I have different winds at different parts of the range, what do I do? How do I manage that? What do I look at? So this was like one of the most like mind-blowing things I heard. And I read this and I talked at length to Nick Vitalbo and Dan Perriard. Nick and Dan are they work together at Invisti and some other stuff as well. And they worked on a device interrogates the wind. So, like Star Trek shit, right? So like you have a set of binos or a spotty scopy looking thing, and you look at the wind downrange and it tells you what the wind is. So there are devices that do this right now. There are some ones for the sailing world, like these big yacht racing guys, America Cup, that type of thing, where they're very expensive. And they use LiDAR, I believe, where they shoot LiDAR out, and it actually tells you how much the air is sort of moving. It's detecting a shift in like mass, really. So there's been some work done and still work being done right now on this type of device that can read the wind for a user. Obviously, it's targeted towards military type folks where, like, okay, look, if we didn't have to train these guys, and it's still the worst, the thing that dudes do the worst. A guy can be a military sniper for years and years and years and never get a chance to become a really good wind reader because he's doing so many other things. His job is not laying out in a range like I did for 20 years or, like an F-class guy. That's all he does. Like these guys are doing all kinds of other stuff. They don't have that time. So, and again, it's all about getting a higher hit percentage. So they developed some testing devices to figure this part out. Like, okay, let's measure the wind at all these different places downrange, and let's map the effect of the wind. So I want to look at what's the wind in the last 20% of the range worth. Shooting 1,000 meters, if the wind between 800 and 1,000 meters away from me, what's that do in percentage of the wind from the first 200 meters, right? So the easiest way to kind of visualize this is think about the range in thirds. First third, middle third, last third. And those thirds have different effects. They're different weights. And so they instrumented stuff. And there's a really great, I'm going to throw a slide up here, and there actually is a link, but you can't click on it, obviously, but you can figure out where it is on their, on the NVISTI website. I still think it's active. And it's called Where Does Wind Matter? And it's an article written by Dan Perrier. Again, 100-pound brain guy. So, oh, I need to share my screen first. So this is very, very, this is super interesting. All right, so here's my slideshow. Okay. So if you look at this chart here, the blue represents the first third of the range. The red is the middle third, and the yellow or orange is the last third. So if you're colorblind, I apologize for this. So you can see at 200 meters, the first third is about 55% of the effect, total net effect. Okay. And then the middle third is from about 55% to looks like about 85%. So about 30% of the wind. And then the last third is only about 20%. So you can see the first and the middle third are really heavily weighted. Now let's look at that throw weight all the way out at 1,000 yards. You see the first third and the middle third are almost equally balanced. And the last third is probably only about 15, maybe 20% of the wind. So what I think is if we're shooting around transonic range, out to about our transonic range, which is kind of where most of our engagements go. We don't a lot of times go into subsonic unless we're shooting extreme long range. And you're seeing the middle third grows the fastest. And the final third grows probably the slowest. And the first third shrinks as we get farther out. So in a way that we can actually use this stuff, for me, I look at the first and the middle third the most. And if they agree with each other, then I just go with what I see in the first third. I almost balance the first and the middle third equally. And unless something bananas is going on in the last third, like you're at a particular range where the wind is actually blowing the opposite direction, this is super rare. But if it's blowing the opposite direction than all the other winds, then think about it. Okay, man. So I've got like all of a sudden the wind's like a different crosswind, opposite crosswind, 5 miles an hour, but that's only 15% of my total solution, right? So this is a great way to visualize it. So hopefully that answers that question. We'll look at some of these other ones. Yeah, so looks like somebody pasted the link. Jay Strutt pasted the link into the chat. Thank you very much. So what's the best? So do I use meters per second or miles per hour? And yes, Kestrel offers great monthly classes. Visit Kestrel.com, sign up. They're free and virtual. I've done one for Kestrel. It is, and I think it was about 2 hours long, to be honest. So meters per second or miles per hour, is meters per second easier for new shooters to visualize? I don't think so, at least not with my broken American brain. I was at a meeting overseas. My company's headquarters is overseas. I work for Lapua and Berger and Vitavori. So like I go to Finland sometimes to talk to these guys. And, it was going back and forth. They were like, why don't you guys use, meters per second and meters and centimeters and millimeters? And I asked them, everybody in this room who has a moon rock in your national museum, raise your hand. Like, oh, that's right. It's just me. Okay. I'll just keep using miles per hour. So, but I think it's your reference point is obviously if you're doing calculations and you're a math guy, meters per second is probably the best because you don't have to convert all this kind of weird stuff. But yeah, I'm a miles per hour guy. And do I use a miles per hour gun calculation in my head when I'm figuring wind? This, I think, goes back to what I was talking about with the different types of reticles that have time of flight dots, or wind dots is the non-technical term. I think I do once I start shooting. What I do is this, 100%. Once I'm shooting, I put a number on it. So if I start shooting on engagement, so Brian Morgan has an unbelievable facility up in Idaho, or over in Idaho for me. I'm out here near Seattle. I didn't have to step over any homeless people going into my house today, but the day isn't over yet. But Brian's got, he's got some really hard to shoot in terrain, and the wind is just crazy there. You're shooting up these mountains, like 20-degree incline for like a 1,500 meter shot. So like wind's just getting crazy up there at the top of these ridge lines. So as soon as I start shooting, I think to myself, I'm on 5 miles an hour. Oh, it's up to 7 miles an hour. Oh, it's up to 8 miles an hour. Like I have a running total in my head, even if I'm holding in mils, right? Even if I've dialed and I'm actually just on the main reticle, the main crosshair, and I'm holding in mils, I'm still thinking it's worth 7. It's up 8. You know why I do that is because when I get off of the range, I want to have that data for somebody else, or I want to have that data for a future engagement. So what I really like to see is I like to see shooters, when they're shooting together, come off the line and discuss what they used in wind. So, if I'm, if Ryan Hay and I are both at a match, and he's using a 6 Creedmoor with a 105 hybrid, going like Mach 11, and I'm using a 308, with a 175 grain, and he gets done off of a stage, and I'm like, hey, Ryan, how much wind did you use? And he goes, oh, man, I shot 0.3. I'm like, okay, cool. And I have my 308. I go up there, and that same wind, is that a good wind call for me? It's not. I'm probably going to miss. So, but if Ryan came off and he said, man, I needed 6 miles an hour of wind, I know what to do with that information. I can use that in multiple ways. I have all these tools I can use once I know the effective mile per hour of the wind. So I encourage everybody to think about the wind in miles per hour. It's kind of the answer to that question, but it's also a bigger question. So like, I have X mile an hour gun. I have a 4 mile an hour gun. That only works if I'm using like a reticle type of deal. But knowing what the wind speed is in miles per hour, total effect when you come off is huge. Where's the best, easiest spot to look for Mirage when you're glassing? There he is. There's my hero, Ryan Hay. So the best spot for me to, obviously, this can be tricky. So like I've used multiple spotting scopes in my career. I mean, I've used them all. Sometimes they focus differently. So like I have a vortex that I use, and that to focus closer to me, and I rotate my focus knob counterclockwise. I have a Night Force spotting scope, and to focus close to me, I have to focus that focus knob clockwise, right? And some binos are opposite. You have to really, really be careful when you're determining if I'm looking close to me or farther away from me. So all that being said, my normal thing is I will focus on the target as clear as I can, and then I'll just back off the focus until I see the Mirage pop. That's usually about halfway between me and the target. Depth of field stuff, some scopes are better than other ones. Like I actually was at the Precision Rifle Expo down in Blakely, Georgia. I was at a couple weeks ago. The Zeiss guys, no, I don't get paid by any of these people. Okay. So the Zeiss guys had a spotting scope up there, and the ability to focus that thing's depth of field was insane. I've never seen anything like that. Like you could change the depth of field on your focus knob. It almost looked like you could dial it by meters, like 10 meters, 20 meters, 30 meters. They had a fine and a rough focus on the scope. So it was crazy. With a scope like that, yeah, I could, okay, I'm going to look at 800. So the easy way to do it is like when I was up at Camp Perry all those years when I was shooting on the Army team, I would actually find an object downrange that I knew how far away it was, and I'd focus my scope so that object was clear. And then I'd go back on the target, and I knew I was looking at the Mirage at a certain range, right? So there's a porta potty downrange, 400 yards from the target. and I would focus my scope on the porta potty, and then I'd swing my scope back around and look at the target and the mirage that I was seeing there, because I'm basically, you're focusing your scope to look at the wind, the air at that range, right? So it depends on the scenario. Usually the easiest for people to look at is about when you start bringing it back, so the mirage kind of pops out the first time, is about 2/3. Let's see. How far would you consider the mile per hour gun calculation method to be good for? 1,000 yards a mile. Okay, so that's using the wind dot thing. Honestly, if you have a scope, I mean, I've got a Tremor 3 on one of my rifles, and it is unbelievably effective. You have to practice it. There's a lot of dots and lines and shit in that scope, right? So you have to really practice looking at it so you can find the things that you really want to see quickly in a scope like that. If you have sort of wind dots or X mile an hour gun. Now that using a rule of thumb, like, hey, at 900 meters, my gun is a 4 mile per hour wind is worth like 1 mil. A lot of those sort of rule of thumb formulas, they fall off right around transonic. So if you've got like a rule of thumb formula, like my old school, when the South African guy taught me 2, 4, 5, 7, 8, 10, that's how many minutes of angle a certain wind is at these certain ranges. That stuff, again, it all works good until about transonic. And if you look at a picture of a drag curve, and it's in any one of Brian's books, you see this really, as you see the drag just go like this right in transonic. And then when it hits Mach 1.9, it goes down like that. So that really eccentric, steep slope of drag curve around transonic, that's why a lot of those formulas kind of fall apart right there. And you have to like add numbers to them to keep them working, right? And that Todd does a good job of doing that too. Like for, instead of just adding 0.1, you add point whatever it is. So like, and a lot of those things you have to like stress test yourself, and kind of see and make your own kind of short wind formula, stress test it. What do you weight heavier when estimating wind? Mirage, vegetation? Well, so I'm unlike a lot of guys. I don't look at Mirage a lot to develop wind speed from it. I do use it for wind speed sometimes, but I use it more as a relative tool. So what I mean is this: we've all seen like books and like articles on the internet, everything about, hey, Mirage is this. And so the Mirage is like, if you see the Mirage going like this, it's like 4 miles an hour wind. And usually it's like a bunch of squiggly ass lines on a piece of paper and saying Mirage angle is this. These squiggly lines mean this. And I'm like, okay, well, that doesn't look anything like the freaking Mirage. It doesn't. It's a bunch of squiggly ass lines on a piece of paper. It doesn't look to me like the Mirage looks like through a spotting scope. So for me, looking at now, you can get really good at Mirage and speed the more you look at it. But if you change locations, sometimes the Mirage looks completely different. How much moisture is in the air, the light condition, the density of the air can change the Mirage. Like if you go shoot Raton, the guys that went to the PRS finale, I really am interested in their take on this. But to me, the Mirage looked way different there. Like I tend to overread the Mirage in a place like Raton. Like I think it's blown way harder looking at the Mirage than maybe it really is. And that might be a function of air density and everything else. So again, Mirage is an appearance thing. So, and Mirage can be spoofed by terrain. I've been on some ranges where there's like a wall or a big berm or a big line of trees that you're shooting up against. And I've seen the Mirage, the wind's going like this. It hits these trees and kind of comes back a little bit, and it all happens at ground effect. It doesn't happen up here where your bullet is. It happens down here where you can see it. And I've seen the Mirage look like it's going the opposite direction the wind is actually blowing. That happens in Phoenix. I've seen it in Quantico, Virginia, at the Marine Corps base there. It happens a lot. So Mirage can be spoofed. So to me, if I see vegetation move, or if you're like an F-class guy, the flags, I always trust that way more because the wind's actually moving something. right? It's telling the truth. It may be different stuff at different places, but it's actually moving the veg, especially if you're shooting up a hill and you may have a little bit of up and down effects, or the wind is compressing against the hill. Guys have to remember that at like subsonic velocities, because of like the Venturi effect. So you have like an air compressor and you put like a garden hose on the end of the air compressor and you feel the air pressure coming out of that, right? And then you put on like a little nozzle that has a little small aperture in it. And then you turn it on, the air force is much higher coming out of it, right? That's the Venturi effect, I think. The wind happens the same way. As the wind gets forced through smaller openings, it picks up speed. As it hits the side of a hill and starts going along the side of the hill, it picks up speed. If you're ever, like, I grew up around New York City, you know, so you go down into New York, you walk around a corner of a building, all of a sudden you get hit with this blast of air, right? And that's because the wind has been funneled through those canyons and stuff like that. So like external stuff makes the wind do different things, and I can see it and I can model it in my brain. So that's that last question here on target rifle range. My favorite flags are Mirage. I look at Mirage for direction of wind. So I'll turn my scope until I find the boil. That's the direction of the wind. And then I'll look at the flags for wind speed, and trying to get two flags lining up so that I'll be able to get an angle on it. So I use flags for direction and wind speed, but that's a specialized thing. I'll throw a bone out there for everybody. If I have it here. Besides all of Brian's books, this book here, the Wind Book for Rifle Shooters. I don't know if it's reversed for you. It's reversed for me. This is by Keith and Linda Cunningham, who are like champion shooters from Canada. And that is it's really oriented towards target rifle shooting, towards F-class, that type of thing. They think about the wind like I think about the wind. So does Brian. So does Brian Morgan and Brian Litt. So like, and Todd Hodnett. We all kind of think about the wind the same way. So that's a great book to get. Again, I don't make a dime, but they're friends of mine and they do a fantastic job. Keith is Canadian, but he was one of those dudes in Vietnam. He just wanted to get it on. He came to the US. He was in a Ranger company, which is, if you know anything about that in Vietnam, that's a big deal, and just wanted to come down and get it on. So he's still up there slinging it, man. He's an awesome dude. So, yeah, so let me see. Any last questions? I think that's about it. We're shooting from cover where the terrain growth structure shades your measuring gear. How much can you rely on vegetation for wind, speed, and direction estimates? Well, again, so if I'm completely shaded, completely protected where I'm at. So here's one thing you can do, like, unless you're a place that you can't do this, before you go shoot a match, guys, check the weather. Use like go weatherunderground.com or weather.com or just go to the internet and look at the weather. And a lot of times it'll give you a by the hour of the day, which direction the wind is blowing and the velocity. Sometimes they're pretty bloody accurate, right? So at least give you an expectation. Okay, like it said 8 miles an hour coming from the northwest, and I'm actually shooting due north. So the wind should be coming from around 10 o'clock at 8 or 9 miles an hour, right? So like that's your initial expectation. Then you go out and you look at the veg and you look at your local environment and see if it jives. But don't go out there cold. Like, don't go out there and blind taste test the wind, right? Do your homework, watch the weather the night before. There's actual wind apps too. I've got like 3 or 4 of them. Some of them are okay. Usually these things are designed for fishing and they're designed for like boating, but there's a bunch of them out there. And actually some of them do a pretty good job of you dropping a pin where you are and it tells you what the wind is going to be. Like go to the App Store and just like type in, or the Google Android. I don't know how that works, but just type in wind and a bunch of shit will pop up. When deciding target size, you take grouping capacity into account. There's more of a swag. I'm not sure I understand that. But when I'm looking at target size specifically, I'm looking at I'll take my Kestrel and I'll say, okay, 1 mile an hour wind at this range is, I'll set my wind speed for 1 mile an hour, and I'll go down to my range card. And if I'm shooting at say 1,200 meters, and I'll go all the way down, and I'll say 1 mile an hour wind is worth, okay, it's worth 0.15 mils, 1 mile an hour wind, right? And then I'll look at my target size through my scope, or just figure out the target size by knowing how big it is, which is pretty easy to do in math. And then I'll say, okay, my target is like 3 times the size of my 1 mile an hour wind number. So that target is 3 miles per hour wide. And that kind of lets me know. And if I have a scope with wind dots, I can actually put the wind dots right on the target where I'm holding, and it'll tell me how wide the target is in wind. Another way of looking at it. Guys, I think Amanda's kicking me off here. So I want to thank everybody for taking the time. I know it's kind of fast and furious. But I think Amanda did record this, and if you guys have any specific questions, burning question, I am the only Emil Praslick on Facebook on planet Earth. So if you guys message me and ask a question, I'll be happy to I'll get to it and answer it for you. I'm an open book. I'll tell you anything I know. But what I just told you guys, looking at the speed, figuring out the direction, putting a percentage on it, and using that percentage either on my dope, on my data, or on the wind speed. If I'm using something where I need to know wind mile per hour and my hold, that's it, man. That's the secret sauce. And knowing what you hit at one range and being able to apply it to the next range, that's everything. So like I come out of an engagement and I shoot, and I figure out that, hey, we use 6.5 miles an hour on that engagement. I go out to the next one. If you guys watch, there's the video of the King of 2 Mile stuff 3 years ago or whatever, and I was spotting. If you look at the video of me spotting, I've got a little cheap calculator and a notebook. That's what I've got in my hands. And so if we hit the first target at with 2 mils of wind, just to keep it easy, and each mile per hour of wind was 0.25 mils, I typed in 2 divided by 0.25. And it was 8 miles an hour of wind. I'm like, okay, we had 8 mile an hour wind. So in my little notebook, I'm like, our next target at 1,900 and something yards, each mile per hour was worth 0.3, say. 8 times 0.3, 2.4 mils, my first wind call. Whack. And you're hitting targets like that. And if you don't know that's happening, it looks like frigging magic. It looks like the dude knows what he's doing, but it's just arithmetic, right? So the same concept, if you have wind dots on your scope and I'm holding a 2 mil hold and I hit with 2 wind dots. And if I have a 6 mil hold, I still hold those same 2 wind dots and I hit the target. Same concept. All right, guys, I am definitely gonna get off now. Sorry, Amanda. So over to you.
You're good. I take notes every time you talk. I learn something new every time. So thank you so much. I truly appreciate it. This was recorded, and it will eventually roll out to the AB YouTube page. I also want to just let everyone know that on December the 7th, Mitch will be doing a class with Kestrel, CDMs, PDMs, and why you need them. And then I have him doing something else later in the month as well. So we have a couple of Zoom things going on in December. And then I've roped Brian into a class that I'll be announcing for January. So look for that information. And again, thank you, Emil, so very much. It's always a pleasure. And thank you everyone for joining us.
Yeah, and guys, I walk the earth, so I'll be at SHOT Show with our booth, with Berger and Lapo and Vitavori and SK Ammunition. So come by and see me if you're at SHOT. Thanks, guys.
That'd be fun. Thanks, Emil.
Okay, do you want me to hang out here, Amanda?
Thank you. Bye.
No, we're good. I'm just gonna hang up and then I'll talk to you later.
Thanks. Bye.
Okay.
I appreciate it.
Bye-bye, guys.
Bye.